Hi, everybody. Jamie Harding here from Reuters Events. Thanks for joining us today for this discussion around remote health. It's a really topical discussion across the world, but in the UK here too. Today, the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, came out and said there should be more meetings done between doctors and patients on Zoom. And so we're kind of replicating that with this panel on Zoom too. But it's a really interesting time in healthcare where we're seeing a surge in digital adoption and remote medicine, partially driven by the situation around COVID-19, which is accelerating innovation in this sense, and at the same time, regulatory bias is leaning towards innovation in a way that perhaps it hasn't done for quite some time. And so it feels like there is a real critical inflection point where it comes to healthcare, where making access a problem of the past is a real possibility, and increasing health equality and access to quality healthcare and patient outcomes are all on the table. And so, with that in mind, I'm absolutely thrilled to be joined today by some real experts on this topic. So I won't share too much. I'll drop into the background and hand over to Angie, who'll be leading the session. But thanks for tuning in, everyone. You can pose questions on the Zoom platform. So let us know your thoughts, feedback, or if you have any questions for the particular panelists. But without further ado, I'll let Angie take it away from here.
Thank you, Jamie. And I'm very excited to be here. As Jamie mentioned, this is such a pivotal time in healthcare. And for a little background, I've been in healthcare IT my entire career, both on the payer and the provider side. So mostly launching new products into the market. And I have not at any time experienced change like this when it comes to digital adoption and really transforming the way care is delivered. Most recently, I was with Kaiser Permanente for about 7.5 years, leading their enterprise-wide telehealth program, launching enterprise-wide video visits, chat capabilities, remote patient monitoring, online physical therapy, a variety of clinical communications, all in effort to improve access to care. A lot of that, had challenges in the initial phases when it came to adoption. The COVID situation has actually removed a lot of those barriers, and we've seen such an incredible uptick. So this is perfect and timely, and I am so privileged to be here with these esteemed guests that are going to be speaking. So I'm going to ask everyone to introduce themselves. I'm going to start with Peter Thomas, if you could.
Yeah, hello. Thanks for the invitation. My name is Peter Thomas. I'm a consultant pediatric ophthalmologist at Moorfields Eye Hospital in London. And I'm also the director of digital innovation for Moorfields, which means I'm one of the people who has responsibility for bringing in new technology that can help improve and change the way that we care for patients.
Thank you, Peter. And Jennifer Esposito.
Hi, so I'm Jennifer Esposito. I'm the Vice President of the Health Business here at Magic Leap. I'm in Florida today, so looking forward to chatting with everyone. Prior to Magic Leap, I worked at Intel in their Health and Life Sciences group, and I also spent a lot of time at GE Healthcare, so really excited to talk about how all different pieces fit together today.
Thank you, Jennifer. And Suraj Kapa?
Hi, thanks for the invitation to speak with everybody. So I'm a consultant cardiac electrophysiologist at the Mayo Clinic. I'm currently based in Rochester, Minnesota. I do a large amount of work related to innovation, both related to artificial intelligence applications, in addition to directing augmented and virtual reality innovation within the Department of Cardiology, which we actually work enterprise-wide on developing new technologies, integrating new tools, and also advise a number of startup and established companies in terms of digital innovation, AI integration.
Thank you, Suraj. Okay, so I'm going to start the first question with Peter. I think Jamie kicked it off talking about how we need to have more Zoom meetings. I think the challenge that we experienced at Kaiser Permanente, and I think most of you have as well, is how do you make remote consultations effective and natural, and how do you scale them? So Peter, I'm going to start with you.
So yeah, remote consultations can mean a few different things to different people. I'll interpret it as mainly video consultations. Mm-hmm. So video consultations, in the UK, they've been going on for a while, particularly in general practice. But to us at Moorfields, they were really a bit of an unknown prior to the COVID outbreak. We had sort of experimented with the technology a little bit, mainly around live streaming of examinations, so attaching a smartphone to a microscope and using that to broadcast the live stream of a patient examination. But we haven't really had an experience with it with the sort of patient to doctor style of interaction, and that's what we launched immediately following the COVID outbreak. There's a lot of challenges with it. I mean, ophthalmology is traditionally seen as a specialty that's not very well suited towards video consultations because we are highly dependent on examining a patient's eyes. So it was really a big learning process to find out what are the really good applications of this technology within ophthalmology. Where does it make a difference, not just in having sort of a meaningless conversation with a patient, but actually, you know, sometimes reassuring them, sometimes actually managing them completely remotely. Our approach was identifying those areas where we thought it could make a difference, rapidly deploying and supporting it. So we were seeing 100 patients a day in our acute eye problem service within a week of the lockdown being announced, and then measuring everything that was happening, measuring how many patients were being kept out of A&E, translating that into the number of reduced opportunities for viral transmission. And once we got some hard statistics that are there, you know, 80% of patients not needing to come in after they've had a video consult, we were then able to use that to say to other services, you know, listen, here's what we can achieve with this technology. And the ball sort of rolls from there. So it's, in terms of the question about scaling, it was really a matter of, you know, really supporting those early adopters, measuring what the output is, and using that to create the case studies that can convince other people to take it on.
Excellent. Jennifer, thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I think, you know, when it comes to, you know, both adoption and scaling, one of the important factors is giving, you know, patients multiple avenues to engage, you know, so it could be you have a get scheduled, you know, health consultation, but, you know, I think providing them other mechanisms through technology, their providers, whether it's leaving, for example, an asynchronous message, and then that gets coupled with data that you might be collecting from them, you know, through either sensors or wearables or their IoT, so that you sort of always have as a clinical worker access to the vital information about the patient. There's maybe more flexibility in how and when they can engage with you, you know, similar to how they're engaging with other industries through their smartphones or other devices, right? So sort of giving them this opportunity to have it at all times, potentially, through that asynchronous mechanism, but also not just about one single mechanism of this sort of 2D teleconferencing capability we've been seeing, especially now through COVID.
Yeah, so Jennifer, I think you bring up a good point. One of the things that we've noticed with technology is that we can now move from that predicted episodic care to more of a continuous care process. Yes. And that way we're actually engaging with patients at the time that they need. So right now, at least in the US, the way things tend to work is that you have a scheduled appointment, and you know, by the time you get to that appointment, you may or may not be in the condition of need. Whereas with these technologies, you can actually intervene at the appropriate times and not just based on a schedule. So Suraj, thoughts on implementation, adoption? Challenges?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question because the truth is, first off, none of this really is new.
It's true.
Remote patient monitoring, doing all of this has been around for ages. I mean, if we think about, you know, within my field, within cardiac electrophysiology, monitors that are used to achieve diagnostic information that are telephonically sent in terms of results, so you could actually monitor people at home, whether it be touching base with your patients or frankly making home calls on patients not the olden days, but decades ago when it was much more standard. In a sense, that was delivering care to the patient where they need it. And I think what's evolving now is that we're opening up the boundaries in terms of how we use advancing technology to integrate these practices. You know, speaking to Peter's point, the issue is how can we use these technologies to not just do the standard fare of talking about a problem that the patient might have, but actually performing the physical examination, doing the other testing, providing rehab services, for example. How do you advise a patient through the exercises they might need after an orthopedic surgery? And that's where we can use a lot of these technologies, spatial awareness of the patient at home, how they move, how they respond to an intervention. That, you know, that's really, I think, where the next step of evolution of telehealth to make it more permanent is going to come from. You know, the payment element in the near term is what COVID has helped get over. I mean, part of the problem for physicians historically has been, yeah, we can call the patient home all the time, but we can never bill for it. So it's a lot of time spent, and there was much more advantage in bringing them into the office. Or we couldn't call a patient across state lines to give them recommendations because, you know, and I know this is a very US centric consideration right now, but I think that does become a highly relevant point when we start thinking about the economics of reaching out to our patients, and also about how we start integrating a lot of, like, for example, many of the things that Jennifer and Magic Leap might be working on in terms of spatial awareness of the patient at home, tools that are low cost enough that you can deliver them to a patient at home to obtain the diagnostic information that you need beyond just talking to the patient or seeing them over a video.
Yeah, I think those are excellent points, Suraj. If I understand what you're saying, one of the things that you're moving towards is how do we better personalize the care? Because now you know what's unique to that individual. And I believe you're working more also in the AI space and trying to leverage that data. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So, you know, one of the big problems when we start talking about the deployment of all these ambulatory tools, especially when we start talking about the wearables, the Apple Watches, the Alive Cores, is the data load. And how do we manage the data load? And that is one area where, you know, artificial intelligence actually plays a huge role. It's how do you scale human expertise and interpretive capabilities of data coming in? How do you bring the most relevant data at the top of the pile? So, you know, you're not getting a lot of false negatives, and you're also minimizing the false positives. The other side of that is actually going beyond standard human interpretation. So, you know, much of the work we've done recently is using a standard electrocardiogram, seeing what data we can automatically derive out of a simple single lead electrocardiogram that you might get out of your Apple Watch, showing that we can determine if somebody might have a low heart function, or we can determine that they, you know, might have specific types of abnormalities of the heart muscle, like hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. And if we can do that in real time through simple diagnostics, we can actually curate which patients or which people need which physician at which time for them to be seen, and which type of tests, and when they actually need to be come in because there might be something more serious going on versus not. So I think AI integration is really on both sides. It's scaling human expertise, clinical expertise, but it's also advancing clinical expertise in terms of interpretive capacity, so we can curate who needs what in a bit of a better way.
Yeah, thank you for that. Jennifer, do you have thoughts on the AI component?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the interesting things is that, you know, it's not just that telehealth is becoming available. It's things like AI. So this convergence of multiple different technologies becoming available is super important, because that's what's different about, I think, today. And so if you are collecting this continuous data about patients, you know, you have this ability to provide alerts and intervene at the right time, versus sort of having to rely on the patient providing the right information. And so I think that's what makes this a really interesting opportunity, to sort of bring all of those different technologies together at the same time. And like you said, this idea that it's really more about continuous health and wellness versus sort of this only reactive approach to patient care.
Absolutely. And Peter, comments, thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, probably at the risk of sounding slightly backwards, I mean, you know, at Moorfields we do an awful lot of AI work. We've had landmark collaborations, particularly my colleague Pierce Keane with DeepMind and Google Health doing automated interpretation of scans of the back of the eye, and those definitely are, you know, a big part of the future of eye care, and ophthalmology is the largest specialty. So that, you know, if those come into our major diseases, that has a big impact on potentially the amount of traditional clinical workload we do. While AI is really useful for thinking a few years in ahead, I kind of think we're sort of putting the cart before the horse in some situations, because there are really simple things that we could be doing with really well-established technology that potentially have a larger impact, I think, in the shorter and medium term than AI does. And for me, there's a lot of problems with the actual infrastructure within healthcare. You know, I don't know much about how it works in the States, but certainly in the UK, it's fragmented. It's far too regional. Taking ophthalmology as an example, which I always will, you know, we have very highly trained professionals in the community, optometrists working on the high street, who have many of the same pieces of machinery we do, able to take photographs and three-dimensional scans of the retina. But simply getting that data into hospital is a huge challenge. We don't have the kind of healthcare IT infrastructure to make that kind of challenge easy. So while all this data is floating about and has great potential in the future, I think there's probably steps to go first before we can really realize the benefit of AI. And just sorting out those steps in themselves will give us a lot of the benefit that we will eventually get anyway. So if I were able to see all the scans that were taking place in the community of people's eyes, I could get an ophthalmologist to interpret those very quickly and prevent a visit into hospital. Now, bringing AI in allows you to accelerate that process still further. But I think before we get to the point of AI having really big payoffs, certainly in the UK, I think there's a lot of work to do around the actual digital infrastructure in healthcare so that we can make use of that data. And I actually think the infrastructure work will bring the majority of the benefit.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Peter, along with that, we had a question from the audience about what percentage of visits for ophthalmology do you think could actually be performed remotely?
It depends what technology we're talking about. So we've done a lot of measurements. Obviously, we've had large scale adoption of video consultations. We've gone from a baseline of not doing any at the start of March. We now do about 3,000 a month. In our emergency eye service, there we know about 78% of appointments that are done via video consultation lead to some kind of definitive output. So a prescription for medication delivered to the patient, or advice or guidance, so that we don't ever need to see them. So in that kind of area of ophthalmology, we think there's quite a large number. In my own area, I deal with abnormal eye movements, and I can actually definitively manage up to about half of the patients I see by video consultation in my clinics. And our oculoplastic surgeons, we're finding there's very high agreement rate between diagnosis of lid lesions seen by a webcam or by a patient submitted photograph. That we're finding very high levels of agreement. So I think in certain subspecialties and certain specialties, the percentage is really high. In others, and I think, for example, of medical retina, so that's the people who deal with macular degeneration, which is one of the world leading causes of blindness and glaucoma, you probably can't do very much by video consultation. The remote care would need to be based around gathering images of the back of the eye at home or in the community optometry practice. And there it comes back to a lack of infrastructure. I need a way of getting that data in from home, from the community providers into hospital, in order that we can start managing those patients remotely. So, and that's just within ophthalmology. And I think the same argument will go across all different specialties, that there'll be disease groups that are really well suited to it, disease groups that aren't so well suited to it, and then disease groups that could be well suited to it if we had the infrastructure and technology. And hopefully those will come over the next few years, but who knows how quickly.
Yeah. Okay, so I think a lot of people have talked about, or at least there's a lot of articles out there about how with COVID, we've seen a big surge in the use of telehealth. Part of it was absolutely necessity. As Suraj mentioned, here in the US, we had some regulatory barriers that were relaxed. That's not necessarily permanent. So the question I think we have is this just a surge and kind of a blip that will go down after COVID somewhat passes, or do we expect this to be a sustainable change in the way care is delivered? And I'm going to start with Jennifer.
Well, I definitely think it needs to be sustainable, right? I think, number one, it's going to take a while, I think, for us to sort of get back to 100% from before COVID. So I think just by virtue of that, people are going to continue to have to use the services of telehealth. I think I've always thought that telehealth was sort of this way to distribute care from a hospital, from big cities, so that people can access it wherever they are at. And so it just seems to make sense to me, especially given, the penetration of things like smartphones, right? In most places, people really do have very easy tools available to them to enable this. So it's not like we have to put a special device into their homes. We don't have to add bandwidth to their existing connections. I mean, yes, obviously there are places that still have connectivity issues and things like that, right? But for a lot of people, this is very practical and possible. And, given that it is so, similar to how they're working now and how they're engaging with retail and all of these other things, I think it's actually going to be quite sustainable. But all that said, right, I think it's super important, particularly, for example, in the US, right, where regulations in a lot of cases were slowing down the progress of of using telehealth, right? None of this video conferencing is new. We could have done this, 5 years ago. So I think it's very important, and I'm definitely seeing action on the legislative front, right, to allow some of the relaxation in the regulations that occurred as part of COVID to continue post-COVID, so that people are, really able to do this without a lot of the friction and frustration that was there before.
Absolutely. Suraj, is this a blip or is this permanent?
I think it is permanent. I can tell you that even before COVID, we as a clinic were actually already working on deploying increasing telehealth capabilities, video visits implemented through actually our patient app. We have about 1 million plus users of the Mayo patient app, and where they could actually just use a video solution to automatically connect with the physician, as well as, for us, the biggest problem really was the regulatory question more than the actual implementation question. And I think one of the big things is, if, at least in the US, if government goes back and reverses a lot of the rules as far as interstate licensing over virtual visits and whatnot, that will be an issue as far as how we kind of push forward. And that could roll back what's happened in terms of the explosion of telehealth capabilities and the ability to actually use it. But I don't see it as a blip. I see it as something that's going to advance. Just for the implementation side, at least here we have the resources and the individuals who will contact patients beforehand, make sure their video is working, make sure that they know how to access it. And I think you need to have processes available in order to allow for that to happen. I think once people start learning how to use it, they become more adept at using it, and people start kind of being much more willing to use it. And that's what we found generally. I mean, I've had virtual visits with people up to 96 years old, and they have been just fine using it and working with it and doing it.
Yeah, I would say we experienced the same thing at Kaiser Permanente. We had a very high touch support model. And back to what Jennifer was saying, this technology, and everyone's been saying, this technology has been available for some time. So a lot of the adoption has been, how do you incorporate this into the existing operational workflows? How do you get the data into the EMR where it's easy to use? And those types of things, as well as how do you support members in leveraging the technology and knowing what to expect? And so I think as it becomes, again, as Jennifer mentioned, other verticals or other types of industries, this is very normal. I think people will get used to it for healthcare as well. So Peter, what about your thoughts? Do you think this is sustainable?
I hope it is. I suspect the answer doesn't really depend too much on the technology or the culture among clinicians, but rather on more political factors and how it's reimbursed.
Yeah.
There exist perverse incentives in most healthcare systems, and we've seen, for several years in the UK, for example, that virtual consultations weren't as well reimbursed as in-person consultations. So under the old payment by results models, the hospital may have taken a hit if they moved everyone onto virtual consultations who could have had in person. And I know in the States, we've already heard the example of in-office interactions being much better paid than a phone call. And I think that's really what's going to determine whether this carries on. Certainly, we're seeing clinicians are engaged with this, want to carry on doing it. Hospitals are making the changes. The issue will be, is it financially beneficial for a hospital to do this, to move to a more efficient form of caring for patients? I think in the UK, the answer is yes. I mean, most places have moved on to a block contract now, so paid a certain amount to provide service, and if they can provide it in a more efficient way remotely, then it makes sense at all levels to do that. But I think what I'd be nervous about in healthcare systems is whether there's some perverse incentive kicks back in and everyone goes back to seed.
Yeah, agreed. I definitely think it's the way it's implemented varies here in the US. If you're in a fee-for-service model, then you're kind of volume-based and, again, responding to those episodic needs. As we shift more towards value-based care, this becomes one of those enablers to reduce the overall cost of managing your patients. So Suraj, I think that you're moving more into what's next. I mean, we know what the technology is today and what it can do. What do you see coming in the next, say, I don't know, 3 to 5 years?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of things that are going to come into play. So, one of the big areas that we at Mayo are working on is we have something called the Mayo Clinic platform that's been created as a separate element of the institution. And the goal of that is actually to start integrating and implementing this kind of model that leverages digital solutions, AI solutions, et cetera. So we actually brought in John Halamka, who was the former CIO, who's also a physician over at BI Deaconess as the president of the Mayo Clinic platform, and also named Rita Khan as our chief digital officer for the institution. So between both of those elements, we're looking at, for example, the hospital at home, where, you know, kind of not ICU level or heavily, you know, disease level critical situations can be done at home. But for example, patients undergoing drug loading for a rhythm issue can still be managed from a distance. And they can stay at home, but nevertheless receive almost similar level care that we'd otherwise be offering. Another example is our cardiac rehabilitation group is working on using digital tools, virtual reality tools, augmented reality tools on how we can provide rehab at home, because that's actually one of the big issues. I mean, we're essentially in the rural Midwest, and to expect somebody who needs rehab to drive 2 to 3 hours to a site to receive rehab care is meaningless, because they can't. I mean, they need rehab in order to be able to travel and do all these things, and you need a way to provide it where they are. So these are a couple of the examples we're looking at. I mean, the final example I'll give is the wearable example. We're working with a number of companies that are developing shirts and vests and underwear for continuous monitoring. And, you know, while the technology exists to do it, a huge question really relates more so to the implementation of it. How does the data get acquired? How does the data get aggregated? How does the data get presented? What do you do with false data? What do you do with data that's missed but nevertheless highly relevant to a patient condition that somebody should be reacting to? And all of those things are areas that we're looking at for those next 2 to 3 years.
That makes sense for sure. Jennifer?
Yeah, I think, you know, over the next few years, you're going to see, you know, even more sophisticated devices come on the market. I mean, you know, Suraj, you talked about shirts and other sensors, right? I think, you know, some of the complexity that I'm seeing in some of the comments around, you know, how do you get somebody that's 80 years old to engage with something like this and learn it, right? So I think we're going to get to a point where the sensors and the devices and that technology experience is a lot easier for patients, because maybe it's not necessarily all in one, right? But it's many things in one device or one sensor, for example, that can facilitate this. So that's definitely a big part of it. And then, you know, another thing I think that is important is this doesn't necessarily have to be in the patient's home. You know, it can be, you know, just like Suraj said, right? Somebody might have to drive 2 or 3 hours to a hospital, but if they only have to go 15 minutes to some sort of community-based environment, whether it's a retail store or a community center, you know, this is a way for them to have some support with the technology itself, right? With another person with them. So we should just definitely remember that this doesn't necessarily have to be at home. It can certainly be multiple different places, but the real goal is that it's not about always going to a big hospital in a city somewhere. Just whatever is most convenient for you. And in that case, you can leverage other types of clinical workers and even family members, right, to sort of participate and facilitate in the experience.
Absolutely. Peter, what's next?
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with everything just said. I mean, for us, I think, you know, looking at my own clinical area again, with the biggest outpatient specialty, my own organization does 700,000 encounters per year. The population's getting older, which means they're developing more eye problems. New eye problems are becoming treatable. For example, wet macular degeneration was a lost cause not that long ago, and now in the UK, we spend £500 million a year just on medications for treating that. That's even with the reasonable drug pricing that we have in the UK. For me, it's about dealing with the vast number of patients and trying to let people practice at the top of their license. So it's about automation. So it's about taking those patients who have straightforward problems, who have a known diagnosis, who can be managed by protocol, whether that's via, you know, some more traditional system or via AI, and moving them onto a more automated process. And again, to take examples from ophthalmology, so like we say, it doesn't have to be at home. A patient could go to their optometrist. The optometrists already have many of the same machines we have in hospitals. They can scan the eyes. Yeah. Why shouldn't we just have that, an automatic diagnosis made from that? patient triaged, the patient reassured, maybe followed up with a video consultation if a chat is all that's needed, but basically trying to remove that large part of the submerged part of the iceberg of patients who are straightforward and don't need to go to secondary care, thereby sparing those secondary and tertiary care doctors for the patients who really need that particular expertise. So automation to let doctors practice at the top of their license, and all clinical professionals, not just doctors. I think that's what's needed to deal with the huge sort of tidal wave of disease that's coming as populations grow in age.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Jennifer.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment, because I think, Peter, you're absolutely right. One of the big advantages here is triaging and really making sure that people are, that you're not necessarily bringing some of the sort of lower severity issues to places that really should be dedicated to the high acuity patients, right? And then along with that is the ability with these technologies to also, not only is it about opening up access, but it's actually helping individual patients get access to the absolutely right provider, right? It's sort of this deep personalization. So it doesn't even have to be their local hospital or the hospital 2 hours away. They may have a special scenario or a rare condition where it really makes sense for them to talk to somebody on the other side of the country. And I think that this is a platform capability that will facilitate something like that as well. And so for me, it's also about this idea of much more personalized access to care, where it is about the expertise that you really need for not only your condition, but really whatever else might be going on for you. And so you're no longer really limited by those geographic variables anymore.
Absolutely. I also think adding on to everything you said, and I think it was inherent in this discussion so far, but it really is the best use of people's time. So not just the clinicians, but it's also the patient's time. And I know I've seen studies on how much time it takes for people to go to the doctor to have their, 15 or 20 minutes. And the cost of that is significant. And so again, like other industries where convenience and consumerism is at the center, I see telehealth supporting that in healthcare as well. So one of the questions we're getting across the Q&A is, what about the security of all of this? How do you alleviate people's concerns around the security? And I'm going to start with Suraj on that one.
Yeah, so I think, data security, data privacy is actually a huge consideration for many different reasons. One thing I always say is that data kind of is the new oil in the world of artificial intelligence. It is probably the most valuable commodity that exists for most institutions. And the question is, do you think of it as a commodity, and who owns it? Does the patient own it? Does the healthcare institution own it? Who gets to operate off of it in order to develop new tools, new technologies that might nevertheless improve human good, right? If we can develop new algorithms off of data that's coming into an institution, and then you obviously at some point need to commercialize that out so people will actually use it and it can actually offer public good. So there's a huge question, first off, related to that element, because that reason that's important is because it's whether or not people are willing to share their data. Because you might have individual institutions, individual companies that want to leverage the value of the data that they have access to, or should all data be public so people can develop the tools off of that data? And then there's the question of data privacy in terms of connecting it back to a single individual. How private must that data be? What is the minimal level of cybersecurity that's required in order to allow for data to be aggregated in some way? There are novel approaches to, for example, machine learning. There's federated learning, split learning that are out there that are continuing to be developed, that are high-level encryption efforts that nevertheless allow for data to retain its core properties, but nevertheless not be tracked back to the source. We actually I'm working on a high-level contact tracing app that's been deployed digitally actually in multiple countries throughout the world, and we actually are using techniques like this so that data cannot be tracked back to the individual phone users, but nevertheless be worked towards public good and offer an automated alert system for potential exposure to COVID. And those examples of privacy, I think, really need further discussion in terms of, again, what the minimal standards are. All cybersecurity can be cracked if you have a big enough gun, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. Any other comments from Peter or Jennifer on security?
Well, what I will say is that I do think that, there's going to be lots of opportunity from some of the technologies that are currently being advanced, right, to really allow that level of privacy and security. And also, I think, allow patients a level of access to their own data, right? I think even patients themselves don't quite have the level of access to data that they need. And so once they do, once there's this idea of the patient having access and ownership of their own data, I think you can have different types of conversation about how they make decisions about what data that belongs to them, right, gets used and how it's used, in accordance with the the corresponding value that they're going to get from sharing it. And so I think that's the other thing to consider here. But I don't think there's any doubt that there's multiple different technological solutions here that can be brought to bear to resolve the concerns.
I mean, I think from my experience, it's about building the case with the patients about these technologies actually showing that they're useful. I mean, we had a process in the UK a few years ago where information from patients, family doctors, their GPs was going to be sort of shared with hospitals, and vast numbers of patients opted out of it because it wasn't explained what the benefits of this would be. It was presented as something that was potentially, an invasive risk to privacy. I tend to find patients expressing less concern about it now as they've got comfortable with sharing their data on lots of different platforms, non-healthcare related platforms. I find I'm being asked less and less about the security of the data, and certainly we set a really high bar in the NHS. So it's really difficult to get new digital technology deployed in the NHS. You have to pass really high standards. I think we've effectively building trust with patients, and patients becoming more open to the idea because they're beginning to see the benefits of what happens if they allow their data to be transferred from one healthcare institution to another, for example.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. One of the other questions that have come across are questions around patient risk in leveraging this technology. What are their risks? What are the things that they need to be cognizant of, and how do they contribute to the success of using this type of technology? So I'll start with Jennifer.
Yeah, I was actually going to kind of bring the point up about, what level of clinical validation do we feel is needed for some of these things? In some cases, we're just talking about a communication mechanism, and you can think about things like uptime and making sure that it's accessible and available. But in some cases, we're also talking about different types of diagnostic tests, or algorithms that might be used to trigger an alert about somebody that might need care. And so I think it's very important that and I've always felt that if we really want to be serious about using these types of technologies, we also have to kind of go through the same sort of rigor that is normally involved in other mechanisms, right? Whether it's drugs or therapeutics, to really make sure that you're able to show the effectiveness and demonstrate the effectiveness, so that there is some level of equivalence to what people are using today, even if it might be some sort of completely analog mechanism. So I think that's something that is a really important topic for people to discuss, because there is a lot of variation in what people are using, right? Some of the sensors and wearables that people are using, they really aren't appropriate for clinical use cases. They're more fitness and wellness. And so you got to strike the right balance between all of those things.
Absolutely. Peter?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, it's a matter of getting the regulation right, isn't it? That you've got your appropriate CE marking, that you're taking into account this concept of software as a device. It all needs to be rigorously done, but we need to bear in mind what the actual application of each piece of software is. Is it a high risk application or a low risk application? We don't want to trip up lots of very low risk applications with a huge amount of red tape, but similarly, we don't want to let some very high risk ones do with minimum scrutiny. Clinicians are typically very good as well at surveillance after these things go to market and get in use. So it's a matter of building up that capacity for research into digital technology within healthcare, so that people are measuring and publishing and constantly auditing, doing all the things we would do for a new medication or a new surgical device, to make sure that the whole medical community is monitoring the safety of these, sharing experience and impacting whether it can be used and what it can be used for.
Yeah, again, it seems to kind of come back to the data and leveraging that data to optimize the experience on both ends, but also to understand when is it most appropriate. And so I'm going to turn it over to Suraj, because I'm sure you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, from all of those aspects, first, to bring up one point, it's a problem in healthcare in general when we start deploying new technologies. The entire concept of interoperability. We've never really cared about interoperability, to be honest with you. Nobody ever, went after that or tried to deal with it. And I mean, frankly, that was the biggest problem with electronic health records. Just the government said everybody needs to have an electronic health record without really defining what an electronic health record it even is. So you just have different people with different definitions of EHRs, and they're broadly defined and broadly considered without really any consistency. And thus interoperability became a huge issue. And this is a problem in the digital spaces, digital tool space as well. And how we're going to not just say, okay, the FDA approved it, this, it's CE marked, et cetera, but actually saying, okay, is there a minimal interoperability standard that should be existing so that a patient, once they go from physician A to physician B, basically all of their data becomes useless because physician B doesn't have access to it, doesn't have the tools to implement it into their system or include it within their data sets? Or it is going to require an independent entity that's going to work kind of almost like the OS for all of this, that sits in the background, and you get a Windows or you get an Apple OS for essentially covering everybody. I know there's some companies like Seekster that are working on broad data integration into singular platforms, but we're going to need all of that in order to kind of push forward.
Yeah, no, I think you bring up a good point. The context for an individual is distributed across a variety of data sources.
Yeah.
And you have to be able to bring that together to really understand the risk of leveraging a certain technology or a certain modality in caring for a patient. And some of that burden becomes in the consumer's world to share it, but they don't have the ability to do so. So interoperability is a huge challenge, especially in the US. Peter, is it as big a challenge in the UK?
Yeah, I'd say so. Yeah, it's something that people are much more aware of. We have a new organisation, NHSX, and interoperability standards are one of the main drives, I think, coming from that. But yeah, it's historically been an issue. Lots of different systems that can't communicate with each other. But I think now a broad awareness to get on with it, and I think there's rapid improvement going on now in adopting interoperability standards. I think some we do pretty well, particularly at the terminology level. So looking at things like SNOMED CT, which is enjoying widespread use, certainly in many of the national audit programs and many pieces of software that come back. Maybe the data level, the interoperability standards aren't quite so well adopted, but it's improving.
Yep, definitely plenty of opportunity there. So we are getting close to time. What I'd like to do is kind of go around and ask each of you for some closing thoughts. So we'll start with Suraj.
Yeah, so I guess my closing thoughts, which essentially have been things that have already been said, is this kind of quote unquote digital revolution in medicine isn't something that was even created by COVID. I think COVID accelerated it a little bit in terms of people having to adopt it, but I think it's definitely here to stay, and actually we're just seeing the start of it. I actually see it accelerating as we continue to push forward, because again, the tools, the technologies, the ability to do at-home diagnostics, they're becoming cheaper, and that's just going to make it even easier. I mean, there's tools that are being used in India that you can do essentially an entire ophthalmologic examination for tools that cost a total of less than $3,000, which actually recapitulates what's in an ophthalmology suite. So with that, we're going to see a rapid advance. It's just the question of integration, interoperability, and data standards, and cybersecurity is going to have to be a consideration within there.
Thank you, Suraj. Peter?
Yeah, I think I agree entirely with that. I think a large part is going to be around digital maturity, getting healthcare data interoperable, making sure that all hospitals are up to scratch, and connecting different parts of the healthcare systems, and getting rid of this divide between primary care and community care. And once you get sort of what is effectively a platform, then it becomes much easier for you to bring on new technologies. So, now if I wanted to bring in, let's say, a home vision monitoring device, well, you need to do integration with the local hospital systems. You need to go through lots of different local services, local processes to get it deployed. It would be nice if what came out of this was the infrastructure, so that if a hospital decides to use a particular application, it's very easy, and it's very easy for the patient as well. So I think that's what I hope will happen next, is a general increase in digital maturity, so that it becomes possible to make best use of all these new technologies. At the moment, we can use them, but it's hard. It needs to become easier, and I hope it will do.
Absolutely. Jennifer?
Yeah, really excited about all of this. And I think at the end of the day, what we're going to see even more of, from what we've seen during COVID, is that patients are really going to be asking for this. And, it's not going to be just about them needing to go to a doctor's visit because of a problem. It's all of these enabling capabilities that are going to sort of enhance their day-to-day life. And I think that's kind of where it's going to come in. It's this idea, like I said earlier, about continuous health and wellness, so that even as a patient, you don't necessarily need to think about when you should go to the doctor. You're going to get that advice in a way that makes sense for your environment and your lifestyle. And I think it also presents a really interesting way of thinking about how we sort of redefine public health, because I think all of these tools allow us to have much more access to data, not just at the personal level, but at the population level. And so we've all talked about population health and social determinants of health over the last 5 years or more, all the time actually, right? These kinds of technologies allow you to really get to that level of information where you can actually better understand micro populations and how to best support them. And so not only is this going to enable greater access to care, I think it's going to enable a much more focused set of conditions around how you deliver care to sort of communities of people that might have similar needs and similar situations. So that's just a thought that I know it didn't really come up in the conversation, but I think it's actually important to think about, because I think this is maybe one of the side benefits that we get from this movement towards telehealth.
Absolutely. One of the things that I found very fascinating is, I would say 3 years ago, when I talked to people and said, I do telehealth for Kaiser Permanente, there was a lot of, what's that? And today, with all the media coverage and everyone going remote, it's becoming very common terminology, and people are starting to recognize it as a basic service that, as Jennifer, you mentioned, people will expect moving forward. I think that COVID has actually just catalyzed or exposed the opportunity we have here. And personally, I'm very excited to see how we continue to extend care and provide greater access to care using technology. So I want to thank everyone for being here for the panel. I really appreciate your time. I think we're closing out, so not sure if Jamie's going to step back in.
Yeah, I'll step back in. Yeah, thank you to all of you guys. Obviously been quiet in the background, but Angie, Peter, Jennifer, Suraj, thanks so much for coming onto this platform to share your expertise. Thanks to you folks in the audience for tuning in and being so engaged and sharing your questions. Sorry we couldn't get around to all of them. I joked with the guys when we were in the virtual lobby before that we could probably take 4 or 5 hours for this panel, but alas, we only have 45 minutes to squeeze it in. But I'm sure we'll continue the conversations going forward. So look forward to seeing you all again on kind of upcoming webinars and virtual panels that we are hosting at Reuters Events Healthcare, and see you all soon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Thanks. Bye.